What if escaping North Korea was basically an impossible mission? This country is, hands down, the most isolated place on Earth. Anyone trying to get out faces obstacle after obstacle. And if they get caught, the consequences are brutal, not just for them, but for their entire family. But is escaping North Korea actually possible? And what options do people even have? For most North Koreans, the ultimate destination is South Korea. There are a few reasons why. They speak the same language, the average person there makes around 50 times more money, and on top of that, South Korea automatically considers North Koreans to be South Korean citizens. Almost everyone who escapes tries to make it there, while only a small number head to Europe or the United States instead. But even though North and South Korea are right next to each other, the journey is insanely difficult, one of the hardest escape routes in the world. Back in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the North Korean government suddenly lost its biggest financial backer. The economy spiraled fast, food production crashed, imports dried up, and the country was pushed into a devastating crisis. As if things weren't already bad enough, a series of massive floods hit the country, triggering a brutal 4-year famine that killed an estimated 1 million people. With no food and no future, more and more people became desperate to escape. Between 1998 and 2011, the number of North Korean defectors kept rising, tripling in just over a decade. But then something changed. Starting in 2012, those numbers suddenly began to drop. Kim Jong-il, who had ruled the country since 1994, died in December 2011. His son and successor, Kim Jong-un, cracked down even harder on anyone trying to flee the country. The regime boosted military patrols along the northern border, rolled out new surveillance tech like cameras, motion sensors, and signal jammers, and even tightened monitoring of phone calls. Escaping North Korea became harder and riskier than ever before. The government also built taller fences and planted even more landmines around major border crossings. On top of that, punishments got way harsher. Not just for defectors, but also for anyone helping them, including border guards. At the same time, North Korea ramped up diplomatic pressure on neighboring countries, especially China and Russia. Russia eventually signed an agreement to deport any North Korean escapees caught on its territory, something China had already been doing for years. Then came 2020. Besides the extreme travel restrictions during the pandemic, North Korea used the opportunity to lock down its borders even more. And by 2023, the regime had started building massive double-layered walls along parts of the Chinese and Russian borders, stretching hundreds of kilometers and packed with thousands of guard posts. North Korea seriously makes escaping feel impossible. So what options does a North Korean citizen actually have if they want out? The first and most obvious is trying to go directly to South Korea. But anyone attempting that is basically gambling with their life. The border between North and South Korea is called the Korean Demilitarized Zone, or the DMZ. It stretches about 238 kilometers long and 4 kilometers wide. And despite the name demilitarized, it's one of the most heavily guarded borders on Earth. There are technically no soldiers inside the zone itself. But right outside it, on both sides, more than 1 million troops are stationed and constantly on patrol. There's honestly nothing else like it anywhere in the world. And if all that still wasn't enough, the border is packed with massive walls, electrified barbed wire, and hundreds of thousands of landmines. Crossing it would mean risking almost certain death, and only the truly desperate even try. But some still do. One of the most well-known recent defectors was Chong-song, a North Korean soldier in his mid-20s. He had been stationed near the border village of Panmunjom when he suddenly made a run for it. As he sprinted toward the South Korean side, fellow North Korean soldiers opened fire on him. Somehow, despite being shot multiple times, he still managed to cross the border. South Korean troops later found him about 55 meters south of the line. He was rushed to a hospital with gunshot wounds to his shoulder and elbow, but incredibly, he survived and eventually made a full recovery. For a while, he even became something of a celebrity in South Korea, appearing on several TV shows. The second direct route into South Korea is by sea instead of by land. But that's also incredibly dangerous. The North Korean Navy constantly patrols the coastline to stop escape attempts. And there's another huge problem. North Korea is one of the poorest countries in Asia, with an estimated GDP per capita of only around $650 a year, ranking above just Yemen and Afghanistan. That means most people simply don't have access to reliable boats, equipment, or enough money to pull off a sea escape in the first place. That basically makes buying a boat and escaping to the south almost impossible for the average North Korean. So for some people, there's only one option left: swim for it. And that's exactly what Chul-eun did back in 2016. Lee worked as a spy for North Korea's intelligence service, monitoring ordinary citizens and reporting suspicious behavior. Even though he held a relatively elite position, he eventually became hopeless about the country's future and exhausted by the total lack of freedom. Lee worked as a spy for North Korea's intelligence service, monitoring ordinary citizens and reporting suspicious behavior. Even though he held a relatively elite position, he eventually became hopeless about the country's future and exhausted by the total lack of freedom. After 2 hours of swimming fully clothed, they were completely drained. Every movement got harder and harder, so they started throwing things away. First their food, then their shoes, and eventually even their pants, just to stay afloat. Around 4 or 5 hours into the escape, they spotted a boat in the distance. Thinking it was probably a North Korean patrol vessel, they immediately changed direction and swam toward a tiny uninhabited island nearby. What they didn't realize at the time was that the island was already part of South Korea. It was a cold September night, and after hours in the water they were soaking wet and nearly naked. Desperate to stay warm, they covered themselves with piles of trash they found scattered around the island and somehow managed to fall asleep. The next morning, they planned to continue swimming, but fear and exhaustion had fully kicked in. Instead, they decided to build a makeshift raft using wooden pallets and chunks of foam they found washed ashore. After drifting at sea for quite a while, a South Korean vessel finally spotted them through a thermal imaging scanner and rescued them. Altogether, they had spent around 8 brutal hours in the water. The third possible route into South Korea goes through Japan. Politically, it's actually one of the better options because Japan will usually transfer North Korean defectors to South Korea instead of sending them back. But there's one huge problem. To cross the Sea of Japan, you absolutely need a boat, and getting one in North Korea is incredibly difficult. Only a handful of people have ever managed it successfully. In 1987, a group of 13 defectors reached Japan using a stolen boat. In 2007, a family of 4 pulled it off. Then, in 2011, another group of 9 made it across. Those are basically the only known successful cases, which shows just how insanely difficult and dangerous this route really is. So that brings us to the fourth escape route, crossing into Russia. At only 17 kilometers long, it's by far the shortest of Russia's international borders. And the entire border follows the Tumen River. There's no land crossing at all, which means defectors usually have their best shot during winter, when the river freezes over. But even then, it's a nightmare. First, they have to find one of the few sections where North Korea's double border wall hasn't been built yet. Then, after somehow making it across, they're faced with a brutal 300-kilometer journey through Siberia in the middle of winter, where nighttime temperatures can drop to around -30°C. And the goal? Reaching the South Korean embassy in Vladivostok without getting caught by Russian authorities and deported back to North Korea. Honestly, it's almost a suicide mission. That brings us to the fifth and most common route, crossing into China. Like the Russian border, large parts of this border are lined with double fences and heavy security. But unlike Russia's tiny 17-kilometer border, China shares a massive 1,350-kilometer border with North Korea, making it a far more realistic option. Most of that border follows the Yalu River, which again becomes easier to cross during winter when parts of it freeze solid. Another advantage is that North Koreans can blend in more easily in China because of similar physical appearance and shared cultural traits. But the biggest danger stays the same. If Chinese authorities identify someone as North Korean, they can be arrested and deported almost immediately. One thing that helps defectors is the nearby Yanbian Korean Autonomous Prefecture, where a large ethnic Korean population has lived for generations. Many North Korean escapees try to hide there temporarily, finding food, shelter, or help while staying off the radar. From there, some attempt to reach the nearest South Korean embassy in Shenyang. Depending on where they cross the border, that can mean traveling anywhere from 250 to 800 kilometers through China without being detected. And because the embassy is the closest one to the North Korean border, Chinese authorities keep the surrounding area under intense surveillance specifically to stop defectors from getting inside. In fact, pretty much every South Korean embassy in China is heavily monitored for the same reason. Which leads to the sixth escape route, traveling across China to reach Mongolia. Unlike China or Russia, Mongolia will usually transfer North Korean defectors safely to South Korea for free. But getting there is another brutal challenge. Defectors first have to travel more than 1,000 kilometers across China, then either cross the deadly Gobi Desert or go around it through freezing northern regions where temperatures can become dangerously low. One of the most famous stories connected to this escape route comes from Hyun-woo Park, a North Korean woman who escaped with her mother through China and eventually crossed the Gobi Desert into Mongolia back in 2007. You've probably seen clips of her speeches online. Today, she's a human rights activist, runs a YouTube channel, and has written books about her experiences escaping North Korea. According to Hyun-woo, the journey took around 2 years, and at one point she and her mother ended up trapped in a human trafficking network before eventually escaping with help from humanitarian activists. Some critics accuse her of exaggerating parts of her story to gain attention or sell books. But what's confirmed is that she really did escape through China and the Gobi Desert before making it to Mongolia. And honestly, that alone sounds terrifying enough. That brings us to the seventh escape route, the longest and arguably one of the most dangerous. Crossing all of China to reach a country in Southeast Asia. The reason defectors usually head south is because Western China is incredibly isolated. There are very few roads or railways, which makes traveling unnoticed much harder and increases the risk of being caught or falling victim to traffickers. Then there's the geopolitical problem. Countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan maintain close ties with Russia and could potentially deport North Korean refugees back home. Going west isn't really realistic either. Afghanistan is under Taliban control, and there's not even a proper road connection between Afghanistan and China. Trying to reach countries like Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bangladesh, or Bhutan would mean crossing the Himalayas, which is basically an extreme survival challenge on its own. And the southern routes aren't exactly safe either. Myanmar and Laos are known for being hostile toward North Korean refugees and have deported defectors back in the past. Vietnam used to be just as hostile toward North Korean defectors. But over the years, heavy South Korean investment in the country has started to shift things a bit. These days, whether you get deported or quietly allowed through can come down to pure luck. That's why the best destination in the region has become Thailand. A huge number of North Korean defectors now try to reach Thailand because once they arrive, they're usually transferred safely to South Korea. But here's the crazy part. This is also the longest escape route of them all. So how do people actually pull it off? Most defectors first travel deep into China, usually by train or bus, heading toward Kunming. The city has some of the largest transportation hubs in southern China, making it easier to disappear into crowds of travelers moving toward the border regions. But there's a problem. China and Thailand don't actually share a border. That means defectors eventually have to pass through either Myanmar or Laos, both countries known for being dangerous and hostile toward North Korean refugees. The one advantage is that the region is extremely sparsely populated, which makes it easier to avoid authorities. But there's a reason almost nobody lives there. It's dense jungle, full of dangerous terrain, wildlife, disease, and basically every survival challenge imaginable. To make journeys like this possible, many defectors rely on family members who already escaped to South Korea and manage to save enough money to hire Chinese brokers or smugglers. And it's expensive. For example, in 2019, the family of Jong-un reportedly paid around $25,000 to a Chinese intermediary who planned her entire route to Thailand. She was considered one of the best-connected smugglers, with powerful contacts who could help move defectors across borders safely. But even with that kind of help, things can go horribly wrong at any moment. That's exactly what happened to Park Hyung-ho and his father, both railway workers. In February 2017, They successfully crossed into China while the river border was frozen. On the Chinese side, a relative met them and gave them a safe place to stay for the night. 3 days later, they boarded a train toward Xinjiang, then another one to Jinzhou. There, they stayed with one of the underground South Korean helpers assisting defectors. After that came an overnight train to Beijing, followed by 6 different bus rides toward their final target, Kunming. But just before reaching their destination, everything fell apart. Their vehicle stopped at a gas station, and Park's father suddenly noticed something suspicious. Chinese police officers approaching nearby. The two immediately split up and ran in different directions. Park hid in a cemetery up in the mountains, surviving by eating food offerings that visitors had left for the dead. And when that food finally ran out, he made his way back toward a nearby village, where he finally managed to pick up a phone signal. He managed to contact the smugglers again, and they picked him up and drove him to Kunming. From there, with help from a local guide, he crossed the dangerous jungle regions of northern Laos and eventually made it into Thailand. Thai authorities later transferred him safely to South Korea. But his father wasn't as lucky. He had also escaped the police at the gas station, but later got arrested on a bus just before crossing into Laos. Chinese authorities sent him to a prison in Liaoning, near the North Korean border. That's when the family launched a massive campaign to save him, filing lawsuits, organizing protests, and lobbying politicians in South Korea, the United States, and even the United Nations. After more than a year in detention, Chinese authorities finally released him. But freedom still wasn't guaranteed. He had to attempt the entire escape again, traveling south through China with the help of smugglers and intermediaries. This time, though, he made it. He eventually reached Vietnam and from there was transferred to South Korea. The whole ordeal lasted about a year and a half and covered more than 8,000 kilometers, roughly the distance from Spain to Mexico or from the United States to Uruguay. And these are basically the 7 possible escape routes North Koreans have in their search for freedom. Honestly, if you stop and think about it, the level of desperation someone must feel to risk their life like this is hard to even imagine. And the worst part? Even after reaching South Korea and gaining citizenship, many defectors still don't feel completely safe. There have been reports of fishermen being kidnapped by North Korean agents while working near disputed waters. But one of the most infamous cases involved Jean Jae-suk, a defector who had already been living in South Korea since 2002. 2 years later, during their honeymoon, she and her husband traveled to China near the North Korean border. They had arranged to meet a North Korean contact who was supposed to smuggle a video camera into the country and later return it with secretly recorded footage. But it was all a setup. Instead of the smuggler, several men appeared, abducted her, and reportedly took her to the Chong-jin concentration camp. According to reports, she died there about 6 months later. Stories like these are why many people consider North Korea the hardest country on earth to escape from. For most defectors, it's not just an escape. It's a near-impossible mission where one mistake can cost everything. North Korea is basically a prison disguised as a country. No matter how much people complain about where they live, it's hard to imagine a situation worse than being trapped there. Especially if you dream of leaving and starting a new life somewhere else. Now imagine for a second that you were born in North Korea. Out of those 7 escape routes, do you honestly think you'd be able to make it to South Korea alive? Drop your answer in the comments, and subscribe for more stories and deep dives like this.